Matthew Naylor next for the Bank of England. He's going to talk us through communicating complex information.
Hi guys, well, David, when he was introduced, it was very clear that he needed no introduction. I'm aware that I probably do. My name is Matthew Naylor. I'm a research economist at the Bank of England. I'm also doing a part-time PhD at the other place. And I'll be presenting, David presented sweeping evidence from a range of studies. My focus will be much more narrow on our study. And I probably have about 3 objectives today. So in a room full of scientists, I'm going to hopefully convince you that economics can also be a science. I'm going to convince, well, we'll see. I'm going to try to convince you that communication in economics is important, and specifically within the world of central banking. And then the third, I'm going to hopefully provide some insights into, thank you very much. I'm going to provide, so this is just a clicker. Can I also go back and forward, or? Yeah, I can.
Yeah, on the pointer.
Okay, perfect. And I'm also going to try to hopefully provide some insights into how to communicate complex information. I will say that this is joint work with Michael McMahon, who is also my PhD supervisor, and is also sat in the room, and you'll have the pleasure of hearing him speak at the panel later this afternoon. And there's a usual disclaimer that applies for both Michael and I that the views expressed in this paper are ours and not those of our institutions that we represent. So I will start with some important context. So within the world of central banking, communication was in many ways not a thing up until relatively recently. Up until the 1980s, actively, central banks were trying to not communicate information. Up until relatively recently, they wouldn't even communicate what the interest rate was, and that's what they do. And this was referred to as Fed speak. Right? So central banks tried to keep markets guessing, and the idea was that if you keep communications cryptic, then this would prevent overreactions from the markets. But as of sort of the 1990s, there was this, what we've referred to as a first revolution in central bank communications. There was this idea that, oh, maybe we should communicate. And you might be thinking, well, is there a need? All the central bank does is sets interest rates. What is there to communicate beyond that? Well, there's 2 reasons. Firstly, from a transparency perspective, institutions like the central bank are not directly voted for by the populace, by the general public, and so from an accountability perspective, we should maybe be slightly transparent as to what we're doing. The second is actually, well, the central bank has 2 sort of remits. 1, keep inflation low, and 2, to stop the financial system from crashing, to put it simply. Those 2 objectives are much easier if you are able to communicate what you're doing, if you're able to communicate the state of the economy, what you expect to happen in the economy, and allow financial markets to be reassured, and the public, firms, households to make good decisions that are consistent with how the economy will evolve in terms of setting prices or even individual behavior like, will I get this mortgage now, will I get this later, etc. And so over the past sort of 20, 30 years, there's been this revolution. We've started, not just the Bank of England, but all over the world, central banks have started to communicate much more information each year. So now the Bank of England publishes 8 reports per year. We have multiple press conferences, dozens of speeches by our members of the committees, and then Treasury Select committee hearings, which are all on YouTube if you want to go see them. And in many ways, central banks have been largely successful in shaping sort of expectations and communicating, specifically with financial markets. They've been less successful in communicating with sort of the general broader public. And so this sort of idea has developed into the second revolution. It's not should we communicate, but how can we best communicate? And well, there's this pretty bleak quote by the vice chair of the Federal Reserve Board, the American central bank, which said, central banks will keep trying, but for the most part, they will fail to communicate to the general public. And this is where sort of a whole new stream of research has developed, including our own, trying to understand how they can do this more successfully. And there's this other nice quote from 2018 from the governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, who said, I think our challenge is to speak in plain English, as opposed to in a high-tech scientific language, which only half a dozen people understand, and even less are interested in. And sort of this has resulted, or this idea of central banks sort of communicating in this complex, highly scientific way has resulted in what has been termed by Michael and the former chief economist at the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, as low levels of informedness about the economy and low levels of trust in central banks across the general public. And is it really a surprise if communications are so complex? Studies indicate that in order to understand FOMC, so the Americans, the US central bank, people would need 19 years of schooling to understand the reports that they communicate. For the Bank of England, for the ECB, the European Central Bank, 16 years, and for the Bank of England, 15 years. And there's this nice graph here, if I can, my hyperlink works, which shows the complexity of communications. This is for the US Central Bank over the past sort of 30 years as they've tried to communicate more. Not only have they tried to communicate more in terms of the number of words, the size of the dots, but they've also communicated more in a more complex way, going up the scale. On the left-hand side is the number of years of schooling you would need to understand this information. So with sort of the revolution in trying to communicate more, they've also started communicating more complexly. Now, in recent years, there have been efforts to try to address this and try to simplify language. For instance, the Bank of England now publishes this new report, which is meant to be simpler, more engaging for the general public. But the big problem is, and this is what this is what I'm going to spend the next sort of 15 minutes talking about. The big problem is that we don't, at least in economics, but I think it's sort of also more generally, we don't have a great way of measuring complexity. What is complexity, and how can you provide a quantitative measure for it in order to understand which dimensions of complexity matter most? But very simply, the most common measure to date is just a simple average word and sentence length. This tells you nothing about the actual content of the information that is being communicated. And this is where we try to come in. So our broad question is the following. In a world in which central banks are trying to get through to a broader cross-section of the society, the general public, which dimensions of complexity should we focus on? And hopefully the implications are not just within the world of central banking, but also more generally for communicating complex messages. So we ask three specific questions. First, how might complex language influence the formation of inflation expectations? You could sort of replace this with anything in any field, but we're going to set the scene within sort of macroeconomics. Second, what actually is, and this is more relevant for this talk, what actually is complexity, linguistic complexity, and how can we measure it? And then which dimensions matter most? Is it average word and sentence length, which sort of the general literature is focused on, or is it something else? And so we do three things. I'll skip over the theory. Second, we measure, or we construct novel measures of complexity that try to capture these broader dimensions. And then we run this randomized control trial to test the causal impact of complexity across these dimensions of complexity on people's level of informedness and trust in the central bank. So what do we mean by sort of complexity in the two different dimensions? So we will refer to two dimensions of complexity throughout this paper. The first is semantic. So this is big, long words versus monosyllabic words, short sentences versus long sentences. This is what current measures look at. The second is conceptual complexity. So difficult words, things you've never heard of, technical terms. And the key distinction between these two types of things is if I were reading, I don't know, a particle physics thesis, you could feasibly write that thesis using very short, maybe not all of them short words, but short words and short sentences. But I would still have no idea what you were talking about. Michael uses this analogy all the time that his sister, yeah. But our hypothesis is really this is what matters, and therefore we should be capturing that. Now, in terms of economics, what do we mean by jargon versus non-jargon? Well, if you put things in terms of everyday words that people can relate with more, i.e. talking about prices rather than inflation, pay rather than wages, jobs, etc., then people will be able to engage with that information more. Now, what we find as a sort of close your ears if you don't want to have the spoilers, but we essentially find the following. True complexity reduces attention paid to central bank messages, sort of theoretically, and then we show that conceptual dimensions of complexity rather than semantic dimensions are what matters most for informant interest, and then something else. But I'll skip past that to get into the meat of it. Okay, so the general model that we have in mind for macroeconomics, and I'll be very quick, this is just one slide, so bear with me. The general framework that we have in mind for the way that central banks communicate is that they put out, the central bank is perfectly informed. I work at the Bank of England, so I will obviously say that. This is the assumption. The central bank is perfectly informed. They know the state of the economy today. They have a good forecast for what will happen in the future, and they try to communicate that message. They release a signal. However, households may not have that full information. In order to get that information, they need to do some research, obtain that information either from the central bank or from other people. So the central bank transmits this message. We publish a report every quarter, revealing the true state of the economy. Households, firms, financial markets can either decide to pay attention to that information or ignore it. And the idea is that, well, the benefits of paying attention to the average individual are pretty low. Who cares if inflation is at 2.5% rather than 2%, and and the implications for whether I get the mortgage today or tomorrow. But the costs are probably pretty high, especially if that information is complex. And so essentially the idea is that the more complex the information, the less attention people will pay, and therefore the less accurate their expectations for the economy will be. Okay, enough of the sort of the macroeconomic environment. Now let's get onto the good stuff. So most studies focus on semantic complexity, and we ask whether conceptual complexity matter. So when we talk about semantic complexity, I'm talking about these average word and sentence length. This is literally the measure that people use. There's this Flesch-Kincaid score, which is 0.39 times, right? Average word length, average sentence length, some plus minus multiplications, and then it spits out a score that basically tells you how many years of schooling you would need to understand that information. The point of this paper is we're saying maybe that's not what matters necessarily. Okay, so I'm gonna plot some. We can essentially plot for Bank of England publications the complexity of their communications over the last sort of 20-ish years. And we see, quite interestingly, this is just the number of words, but we see this increase in word count. Look at focusing on the blue line to start with. This is the flagship quarterly report. We see the first revolution in central bank communications. We see the increase in the length of the reports that they're providing, going from sort of 15,000 words to around 22,000. And then around 2014-15, there's this trend decline to around 2019, as we realized, oh, maybe it's not just quantity of information, but also quality of the information that we provide. Now, there's this is separate to the paper, but just a couple of things to note here. There was a particular spike in 2016 Q3, which you might recall is just after a certain referendum, where we decided maybe we should communicate some information about that. And then spikes around COVID and the Russia crisis. So clearly this is also sort of associated with uncertainty in the environment, but we see these trends. And the trend is very similar as well for the Flesch-Kincaid score, this average word and sentence length. We see this, as we're communicating more information, we see this increase in complexity, and then from around 2013, there's a decrease. And this is where I'll talk about the other two lines. So this green line is the visual summary, which I referred to about 3 minutes ago, which is this new publication that the Bank of England has started to release to specifically try to engage broader audiences. And we see that, okay, it is less complex than the blue line, the flagship quarterly report. And so by this metric, you might say, okay, job done. Bank of England has simplified its communications. We're now engaging broader publics. Fantastic. We can pat ourselves on the back. Maybe not. Maybe that's not the whole story. So we produce these two measures. First is very simple, proportion of jargon. Right, so we have number of jargon terms as the numerator, number of total words on the denominator, and we say, okay, maybe that will give us some sense of just how conceptually complex this information is. This is a very crude measure, and I'll hopefully show you a more sophisticated one in a second. Now, what do we mean by jargon? Well, we curate this dictionary of jargon terms. Now, the dictionary that we produce is for an economics setting, so based on sort of A to Zs of economics, business, and financial terms. But we try to explain that the method that we're using here should be sort of transferable across disciplines if you just tweak this dictionary. So our dictionary for this contains 350 jargon terms in general. And then what we do is we categorize these jargon terms into different topics, across 10 topics. These are all economics topics, doesn't really matter what they are for these purposes. And then what we do is essentially we create this other measure, this conceptual complexity index, which is the sort of selling point of our work. Essentially what we do is we take the proportion of jargon terms and we do two manipulations to it. The first is we adjust the complexity for the range and breadth dispersion of jargon terms within a topic. Right? So if you're within one topic, if you're using many different words to describe essentially the same thing, we argue that adds complexity. If I'm talking about, let's say, GDP, as economists always are, then I can use GDP, growth, output, activity, all to describe the same thing. The more you use and the less concentrated the terms are within a topic, the more complex we hypothesize is the information. The second is this adjustment. You can't see this in this chart. This is purple. The adjustment for the number of different topics. So the more topics that you cover, also the more complex that information. And so again, we plot for the Bank of England these two measures. So this is just the simple proportion of jargon. We can very quickly see that, well, focusing on the blue line to start with, previously we saw this increase in complexity and then this trend decrease as we try to simplify communications. That's not visible here. And concerningly, this green line, the visual summary, which is meant to be more relatable, well, maybe it's not that more relatable than the flagship blue quarterly publication. This, in terms of the proportion of jargon, we then we're adjusting for the proportion of jargon for these other two dimensions of complexity, right? So the breadth and range of jargon terms in the different topics. We produce this conceptual complexity index, which captures those other dimensions. Now, okay, if you look at the visual summary, right, fine. That actually maybe they've not done too bad a job for that. Right. That even by this metric, that is less complex than the other publications. But across the other publications, we don't see this trend decline in recent years. Right? So there's sort of mixed evidence. It doesn't look like they've been targeting these metrics of communication. So I guess the question is, okay, so which matters more? Is it semantic? Is it conceptual? And so to test this, we run this randomized control trial. We have 1,859 representative members of the public. We sort of ask them a load of pre-treatment questions, all the usual jazz, to capture their sort of demographic characteristics, their interests in an understanding of the state of the UK economy, and then we randomly assign these participants to hypothetical central bank reports. Right? And these central bank reports vary across conceptual and semantic dimensions of complexity from high to medium to low. Now, they communicate the same fundamental information, and they are based, as a benchmark, which we then tweak the complexity of, they're based on actual Bank of England publications. So to give you an example, if we're just reading sort of the first two sentences, this is the lowest complexity text that we have in our survey. Over the past year, prices have been rising faster than wages. That means people have not been able to afford as much. We think that is changing. The share of people out of work is now at its lowest level since 1975, and there are a lot of job vacancies. Right, let's just focus on that. So we tweak that from the semantic complexity dimension, right, so average word and sentence length. We change that to sort of, over the past year, prices have been rising faster than wages, meaning that people have not been out of work. We think that is changing with the share of etc. You can also tweak that across sort of the conceptual dimensions. So instead of using sort of talking about jobs, etc., we're talking now about unemployment, the labour market is tight, adding these sort of conceptual, technical jargon terms. And then finally, and this is actually based on an actual report that the Bank of England publishes. What does that mean, right? And this was the red line, which I didn't reference before. This is from the benchmark. It's the red publication that the Bank of England. It's the monetary policy summary that we produce every quarter. Right. So I mean, that is very clearly complex. But the point is that it's actually, you can tweak the semantic complexity, average word and sentence length here, and it would still be very difficult to understand that hypothesis. So essentially, we randomly assign these participants to these different reports, ask them a load of questions after the trial, after the treatment, to capture their levels of informedness and trust. And we basically try to capture their perceived understanding, so how much they think they understood. And we see this very clear drop-off, as you might expect. So the colours represent the conceptual complexity, how much jargon, breadth of jargon, etc. And the patterns represent semantic complexity, average word, sentence length, etc. So we see that the green and the blue, as you go from low to medium conceptual complexity, not much of an impact. The big action is happening as you increase conceptual complexity from sort of medium to high, where high represents this, reflects the complexity of that report the Bank of England report. And then, interestingly, we don't see any sort of significant difference between sort of medium or high semantic complexity. So we're not seeing any action on the semantic complexity side, average word and sentence length. It's all coming through the conceptual. This was for how much people believed they understood the information. We then also actually tried to capture their actual understanding based on asking questions about sort of what was the inflation rate, interest rate, expected pay in this economy that we described in the treatment. And again, all of the action really is happening as you go from blue to red, increasing conceptual complexity above this threshold level. People sort of stop understanding what's going on. And then no significant differences between between the patterns. Then finally we ask, not quite finally, I've got 45 seconds. Then we ask people about their sentiments towards the central bank. Right? So having read this report, how much do you feel like you now have a greater degree of trust in the Bank of England? Willing to pay attention to future sort of documents published by the Bank of England, or feel like you understand its role? And again, it's all about conceptual complexity. At that level of conceptual complexity, people stop having these positive sentiments towards the central bank. Now, in economics, we try all sorts of what we call identification strategies to tease out causal effects. Often the simplest way of identifying what's going on is just by asking people. So we ask these respondents, okay, what would have made the text easier? And sort of unsurprisingly or consistent with our results, people are pointing to sort of the technical concepts, technical words, rather than sort of shorter sentences, shorter words. And this is, I'm 15 seconds over time, but this is quite an interesting thing. So we've talked about this representative sample of people, right? So we're talking about central bank communications or just communicating complex information with the general public. In our sample of nearly 2,000 people, we also have a subset who studied economics at university. And so we repeat the results with the subset that studied economics. And essentially we get this. Sorry, this is a table. I didn't want to present a table, but this is a table which basically tells us that at high degrees of conceptual complexity, maybe I should highlight it with my mouse, we get these negative effects across people's perceived understanding, actual understanding, and sentiments towards the central bank. So that's people who have economics degrees, this stuff matters even for them, right? So even potentially for experts. Conclusions, implications, etc. I'll leave them on the board, but thank you for your time.